My PhD research.
Okay.
So I'm doing a research project in the Theatre and Performance Department at York St John University on queering the archive. So I spent the last 4 years researching queer history. It's still ongoing, and I'm building it into an app with audio and writing prompts and all sorts of information. Hopefully that app will be ready to roll out next LGBT History Month. So I thought this year we'd go out on the walk. So we're doing 16 sites today out of 58 confirmed sites that I've got so far in my archive. 100 still to work through, but it's kind of a lifelong project, I guess. So yeah, obviously Jake did a tour yesterday that was a more broad LGBT history, more of a social history. So to differentiate, this one is purely literature and poetry related. Also should add, even though it's LGBT History Month, I label mine as a queer history tour, purely on the basis that, because I'm an academic, I've got to be able to reference everything, and I can't use some of the modern terminology when referring to a lot of the people that I'm talking about from history, because I don't know for certain if they would have used that terminology. But we'll get onto the word queer in a moment. Quick sort of trigger warning thing, which I suppose goes along with any LGBT history tour. Queer history is not always gentle history. Some of these stories involve persecution, censorship, loss, death. But this is important. It's not just a story of suffering. It's a story of defiance, creativity, joy, and the sheer audacity of queer existence. So the first stop is actually behind the art gallery. So we'll walk around there. So I want to start with sort of the history of the word queer, because it's quite sort of central to my research. The first recorded instance of queer being used as a slur for homosexuality was actually against the person related to this site. It's Oscar Wilde. On this site in 1861 was built the exhibition hall, and in 1884, Oscar Wilde visited the exhibition hall twice on his lecture tours. So he stopped here on January 31st and delivered 2 of his lectures, The House Beautiful and Personal Impressions of America. And then he revisited in October the 9th, to give his talks on the value of art in modern life and dress. Basically, he was here telling Victorians how to redecorate, how to dress better, and why art was the pinnacle of human existence, which is about right for Oscar Wilde. So we are going to go on to other sites related to Oscar Wilde, because thanks to his extensive letters and diaries, we not only know where he came and gave his lectures, we know where he stayed and what he did with his evenings. So we'll be coming back to Oscar Wilde. It's also worth noting that even though queer was used as a slur in 1894 against Oscar Wilde by the Marquess of Queensberry, which is the father of Lord Alfred Douglas, also known as Bosie, Oscar Wilde's famous lover, it wasn't reclaimed as a word until 1990 by Queer Nation. So it took almost 100 years for us to reclaim that word. Okay, the next stop is King's Manor. So we're just going out the front and into the courtyard there. Okay. So for anyone who came on the walk yesterday, you'll know why we're stood here. Yeah, a queer history tour wouldn't be anything without a little royal scandal. So when the monasteries were dissoluted by Henry VIII. He claimed this building as his sort of seat in the north, with York as the second city. As you can see there are a number of plaques around here. Charles I stayed here, and on the plaque at the end there, it says that James I also stayed here. Now, James I is the one we're interested in today. As Jake went through yesterday, the archway here, the two figures at the top are meant to be sort of stone depictions of James I and his lover at the time, George Villiers. Now obviously this is meant to be a literary tour, so what is James I's connection? Well as being a scandalous monarch, he was also a writer and poet. So he wrote several books. One was on what it means to be a king, what your responsibilities are, and one on demonology, which basically was his handbook for witch hunts. But he also wrote poetry. One of his most famous poems is called Tragedy of a Phoenix, and it is dedicated to one of his lovers, the Duke Esme Stuart. So it's actually a double acrostic poem. So it says Duke Esme Stuart down the left, and then at the end of each of the lines it also says Duke Esme Stuart. I can't really comment on whether it's a good poem. It's a difficult read, but yeah, he was fascinated by the written word. Also, as we learned yesterday, this was also a boarding school in, was it 19th century? And Anne Lister was boarded here, and it's in local law that she met her first love, Eliza Raine. It's said, I've not found any sort of concrete evidence for this, but it's said that on the glass in the courtyard is etched some writing that may have been by Anne Lister's hand. But I've not found anything that confirms that as yet, so it's not in the archive, but it will be if I can confirm it. So, sorry?
Do you know what it says?
I cannot remember what it says. We went through it yesterday. It's basically, I think it's initials, like loves, so it's that kind of thing. I can't remember off the top of my head what it actually says. I'm hoping at some point to go in and find out and get a good look at it. So yes. So that is James I. We will be coming back to James I later on because there are other sites connected with him in York. We'll also be coming back to Anne Lister. I'm not going to go too far into Anne Lister because obviously there's an Anne Lister tour and she's going to crop up on every LGBT history tour, so you know, she's a diarist, but whether or not she's connected to literature and poetry is a bit more tenuous. So the next site, we're going to go through the archway there and up Bootham to the birthplace of W.H. Auden. So this house is the birthplace of Wystan Hugh Auden, better known to the world as W.H. Auden. He was born on this site in 1907, and York have claimed him, even though he only lived here for a year before moving on with his family. But obviously it's the key thing in York. If you're born here and later become famous, they will claim you and you'll get a plaque. So that's how it works. Auden was unapologetically homosexual at a time when it was actually very dangerous to be so. He actually married Erica Mann, the daughter of the novelist Thomas Mann. But this was a marriage of convenience, sort of like a lavender marriage, but the other way around. It was to provide her with British nationality, saving her from the rising threat of Nazi Germany. Auden's true devotion was to Chester Coleman, an American poet with whom he shared a lifelong partnership. Though the relationship was complex and tumultuous, Auden never stopped considering Coleman his husband. Though he eventually left England for America and then later Austria, Auden's legacy is global. When he died in 1973 at the age of 66, he left behind such a huge body of work. He's one of the few poets whose collected works are in multiple volumes. So yeah, to get hold of all of his stuff is quite a feat for a bookshelf. So yes, this is the birthplace of W.H. Auden. I highly recommend looking up his poetry. There's a lot of queer themes. Although most of the time it was very sort of euphemistic, there is one very long poem I'd highly recommend. It's called The Platonic Blow, and it's exactly what you're thinking. It's a very long poem that takes you verse after verse through a very intense sexual encounter. So I highly recommend it. Okay, so we're going to go up to the crossing and cross over the road because our next site is actually over there.
Oh,
okay.
Jess lives over there.
This is Joseph Roundtree's house. Now, obviously, Joseph Rowntree was a businessman and social reform pioneer whose name's obviously linked to confectionery, having the factory up Haxby Road. Unfortunately, it isn't Joseph Rowntree that we are looking at today, but Virginia Woolf. So, when doing the research for this project, sometimes it's looking at court records and things like that. Sometimes it's letters and diaries. Sometimes I just get a list of people and think, I want them in my archive, can I find them? And Virginia Woolf was one of those people, as was Oscar Wilde actually. And it became a bit of a project of, can I find them? Have they been anywhere near? Have they been close enough for me to put them in the tour? And in this instance, yes. There are a lot of people that I would love to have in the archive, but just haven't come close enough to be sort of named in the tour. So it was in March of 1913. Virginia and her newlywed husband, Leonard Woolf, embarked on a political tour of the industrial north, part of Leonard's work as a political journalist. We don't know exactly where they met. The chances are they went to the factory, but we do know that they spent the evening here. And it's in Leonard's letters actually that we know they walked down Gillygate, past the Theatre Royal, and towards the station en route to their next stop, which I believe was Harrogate. There you go. It was later that same year in 1913 that Virginia Woolf experienced one of her first significant mental breakdowns, a foreshadowing of the deep waves of depression and anxiety that would follow her for the rest of her life. Now, Virginia Woolf is obviously discussed as a literary giant, a modernist, a feminist, but she is also undeniably queer. Let me just turn this page and hope they don't dissolve. Yeah, it's all coming apart, mate. That one. I should have just laminated the lot. There we go. So, in 1922, Virginia Woolf began a whirlwind romance with novelist, journalist, and socialite Vita Sackville-West, who we will return to shortly later. She didn't come to York, but her name does come up again. Their love letters are an absolute masterclass in desire, longing, and poetic excess, filled with deep admiration and flirtation. And crucially, they weren't secret, so we can read the letters. Vita's husband, Harold Nicholson, was aware of the affair, as was Leonard Woolf. Theirs was a world in which marriage and sexuality existed in a far more fluid and open manner than the structures that society imposed at the time. But it was more than just an affair, it was inspiration. In 1928, Virginia published Orlando, arguably the most overtly queer novel of her career and of the time. It's a dazzling, time-bending, gender-shifting exploration of love and identity. Orlando was originally written as a love letter to Vita. Now, in the early editions, it was tributed to Vita, but that was removed in later editions. So whether or not Vita thought it was complimentary or not, sort of remains to be seen. Unfortunately, in 1941, at the age of 59, Virginia Woolf ended her life, filling the pockets of her coat with stones and walking into the River Ouse near her home in Sussex. Not our River Ouse, different one. But yeah, for a moment in 1913, she walked down these streets that we're about to walk on. So, yeah. The next site, we're going to go to where Booth and Bar is and stand there. Oh. So yes, we'll obviously have to cross the road a couple of times, so be careful. So the next site is actually up Gillygate, but obviously because of narrow paths and it's a very busy street, I didn't really want to take a tour group up there. Plus there's nothing to look at, so I thought I'd just give you the history from here. So up Gillygate, at 42 Gillygate, so it's just before you get to the Gillygate pub. In 1998, a queer bookshop opened called Libertas. It was founded by trans lesbian Jenny Roberts and her partner Anne Croft. Libertas wasn't just about selling books. It was about creating a space, a place where queer women could gather, where they could see themselves reflected in stories, and where they could exist fully, loudly and proudly. By 2002, it actually earned itself the title of Europe's #1 lesbian bookstore, which is pretty cool for a tiny place like York. Unfortunately, it closed in 2003, moving online. But some of the memorabilia from the shop can still be found in York Castle Museum in their Out of the Closet exhibition. And they also founded the York Lesbian Arts Festival, which still runs today. Okay, we're going to go to the Theatre Royal now. Hopefully there's somewhere we can stand to avoid the elements. So this is another Oscar Wilde site. So. I've given up trying to keep the pages nice. I'll put them in my pocket for later.
Nice filing system you have.
Yeah, very organised. I'll sort it later. Okay. That's not my archive. No, that's not my usual process. So, in 1884, when Oscar Wilde was on his lecture tour, he was invited to attend a performance at the York Theatre Royal. Now, unfortunately, he didn't know what performance it was, so it can't have been that good. Or maybe he just didn't think it was as good as his stuff, I don't know. However, one of the sort of notable things for this sort of visit is that he was sharing a box in the theatre with Frank Lockwood, who at the time was the Liberal MP for York, and was actually a former Cambridge acquaintance of Oscar Wilde. The most notable thing about it is that 11 years later, it was Frank Lockwood who would be standing in the courtroom prosecuting Wilde for gross indecency. So obviously he can't have had that much of a positive impact when sitting with him in a theatre box. Obviously theatre was central to Oscar Wilde's life, not just as an audience member, but as a playwright. It was in the theatre world that one of the most famous symbols of queer history was born, the green carnation. So unlike the violets of Sapphic longing and the lavender hints of later queer identity, the green carnation is not a real flower. It was manufactured by a small London florist at Wilde's request, designed to be a subtle but unmistakable symbol of queerness, something you could wear in your lapel and those in the know would know, but everyone else would just think, oh, that's nice. The first time it was worn was at the premiere of Oscar Wilde's play Lady Windermere's Fan in 1892. Wilde instructed his inner circle, including Lord Alfred Douglas, his lover, to wear one in their lapels. And it has since become a symbol of queer identity to wear a particular flower or a particular brooch in your lapel. Okay, so that's the connection with the York Theatre Royal. I don't know which box he sat in, but I'd happily go and sit in all of them just to make sure I've sat in the right seat. So the next stop is the assembly rooms just down here, so we'll be crossing the road again. Yeah, okay. This is the amazing assembly rooms. I've not been in a long time. Are those the chandeliers you were talking about?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh wow.
Because they decided to revamp it, and then they sold them all. So and then they tried to buy them back. I can't remember.
It's so strange that it's a restaurant and not
I know, it's
something more. It should be a bookshop or something, like something
Better
amazing.
than being closed.
Yeah, that's
True.
true. Yeah.
So,
And it's cheap. You can go anytime.
so the assembly rooms were built in 1732 by Lord Burlington. The grand chandelier-lit Corinthian columned spectacle was a place to be, to dance and to gamble, and most importantly, to gossip. It was York's answer to the assembly rooms of Bath, but with more northern grit, fewer Austen heroines, and probably more scandal. It was here in 1809 that a young Anne Lister attended with her first love, Eliza Raine, who we talked about earlier. But then it was a year later, for the Christmas season in 1810, that she started a whirlwind romance with Isabella Norcliffe. Now, unfortunately, this sort of led Eliza Raine into a period of mental distress, experiencing paranoia and jealousy. And she actually ended up in a mental asylum out in Oswaldwick. This seems to be sort of a recurring trend with Anne Lister. A lot of her lovers suffer mental distress and lock themselves away in one form or another. Also worth noting for this building, it's not necessarily a literary thing, but around the same time that this would have been happening, out here we had the Lamplighters, which were a collection of young boys who would escort gentlemen down the riverfront where it was dark with lamps or torches. An escort is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence, because they, yes, were going down a very popular cruising area out of sort of the sight of prying eyes. So it's where you came to dance and gossip and then come out and get walked home by a rent boy basically at the time, and then walk home down by the river or through Museum Gardens, which we also know to be a historical cruising spot.
Oh, evening sorted.
Yeah, so drinks, dance, walk home, bit of fun in Museum Gardens before they started locking it. That's probably why they started locking it. And then, yeah. So the next site we're going to is Betty's. Now, depends where we're going to stand, because there might be buskers, so you might not be able to hear anything, but...
Might be Phantom of the Opera. Sorry.
This is the final sites associated with Oscar Wilde. So, before Betty's Tea Rooms was here in this lovely sort of corner building, there was actually a long, thin building that stood, and it sort of went into the street there and came right out into the square here, and obviously blocked what would have been the road. So the building was knocked down in order to widen the road. It was actually a hotel, and it's where Harker's gets its name from, because it was Harker's Hotel. And so we know that he stayed here because the ledger from the hotel still exists. I believe it's in the Queer Britain Museum in London. So he stayed here during his lecture tour. Now, obviously, Oscar Wilde wasn't a man to, enjoy his quiet nights in. His entire lecture, all the notes from his diaries of those years are just champagne-fueled romps about each city centre whenever he's staying over. So the likelihood of him actually sort of staying in his hotel room is pretty slim. But he was staying here in 1884, obviously not knowing that 11 years later he'd be on trial. 12 years later he was exiled, and 16 years later he was dead. So it sort of happened very quickly after that. The next site we're going to is down Coney Street. Percy Shelley is the next person we're... Ooh! Magnets! Sorry.
Still with.
Wow. So, these three buildings here were once connected. We don't have any record of what the inn or hotel would have been called, but it's on this site in 1814 that the poet Percy Shelley visited with his first wife, Harriet Westbrook. Now, there are a lot of sort of conflicting arguments around particularly their honeymoon, because it wasn't enough for Percy Shelley to go on a lovely tour of the north with his first wife. He also brought his best friend, which is quite peculiar. So some scholars argue that his friend was chasing Percy Shelley's wife, although why you'd invite him if that's the case. And some argue that actually he was there because he was wanted there. Unfortunately, later in their honeymoon, things came to a bit of a head, and Harriet Westbrook went back to London, and Percy Shelley continued his honeymoon with his friend, which I think sort of pops a nail in the coffin for that one. So, Percy Shelley's sexuality has long been debated and still rages on. While his many love affairs with women, he had 2 wives, are very well documented. His deeply intense relationships with men have raised more than a few scholarly eyebrows. His lifelong devotion to Thomas Hogg, who was his friend, who he brought with him on his honeymoon. And he was very close with his school friend, Edward Trelawney. Also, he used to hang out with Lord Byron, so there's, it raises a lot of questions to start with. Byron's probably the only person in my archive that I would happily label as bisexual, just because I think he would have claimed the word. I think he probably had taken it further and said something like omnisexual, or he was. There were a lot of countries that he wasn't allowed in. He was exiled from because he shagged everything. That was basically so long and short of it. Percy Shelley's life ended as dramatically as he lived it. Basically, he drowned in a storm off the coast of Italy in 1822. His body was burned on the beach while Byron and his friend Trelawney stood by and watched. And because obviously Shelley had to be dramatic, his heart refused to burn. We now know that it's likely he had TB and his heart was calcified, so it wouldn't have burnt. And obviously because they're romantic poets and naturally very dramatic, Mary Shelley kept the heart in a drawer, wrapped in some of Shelley's poems.
Byron kept it?
No, Mary Shelley kept it. Yes. I imagine there was quite an argument, but so Mary Shelley was buried with Percy Shelley's heart. However, Percy Shelley's not buried with Mary Shelley. He's buried in Italy, she's buried in the UK, and he is buried with his friend, Edward Trelawney. Oh. So, yeah, I think it's relatively easy to come to some conclusions there. So the next stop is, there's a plaque, it's over there. We're going to be talking about the Brontes. So yes, we'll walk down there. This is the site associated with the Brontes. Now, I have reason to believe this plaque's wrong.
Oh.
It's controversial.
Challenge.
So, so the plaque states that Charlotte and Anne Bronte stayed here in 1849, excluding Emily. However, Charlotte and Emily also stayed here in 1845, that we know from their letters and diaries. So why that didn't make it onto the... I assume it's just for space. But surely you'd want to claim all three. I'll just say, you know, all three stopped here at some point in those years. So, yeah. So Anne and Emily visit in 1845. And then Charlotte and Anne, as it says on there, visit in May 1849, staying at what was George Inn. But all three of them were drawn to York Minster. Obviously, Gothic Cathedral, the Brontes kind of fits. Basically, they sort of each made a sort of pilgrimage visit to York Minster shortly before each of their deaths. So there's kind of a weird, sort of a weird poetry of like the three of them coming together, one of them dies and then two come back and then there's just the final one. So they used to all write around the same table at Haworth Parsonage. So a lot of the ideas, they would sort of bounce around and off each other, and so a lot of their experiences obviously ended up in each other's writing. When they first published, they published under male pseudonyms, as was sort of the habit at the time to kind of get seen. So their pseudonyms, Charlotte was known as Cora Bell, Emily was known as Ellis Bell, and Anne as Acton Bell. Although, this is where it sort of starts to get into the sort of queer side of it, is Charlotte, even though in later years they revealed themselves and didn't go by the pen names anymore, Charlotte still used hers. She quite liked having a male name. So one of the things that, as I said before, like when you look for names of particular people and then you start to put the years down and you think, right, the Brontes, West Yorkshire, 19th century, Anne Lister, West Yorkshire, 19th century, did their paths cross? And we know they did. So it was Emily Bronte. So she was a teacher and she supervised a number of school trips. One we know for sure was at Shibden Hall, where famously Anne Lister lived. And it was about 2 years before Anne Lister died. We do not know if they were in the building at the same time together. There's no recollection of that. But what we do know is that she stayed in the Red Room, which is where Anne Walker, Anne Lister's later wife, sort of locked herself away when she was having her periods of sort of intense mental distress. And this may have been the inspiration for the Red Room in Jane Eyre? Yes, Charlotte's book. So obviously Emily goes back to the table at Haworth Parsonage and talks about her visit to Shibden Hall, and then some of the details filter into Charlotte's writing. Further research sort of illuminated on the facts that Lister may have actually inspired the character of Shirley Keeldar in Shirley. And Shibden Hall may in fact be the inspiration for Thrushcross Grange in Wuthering Heights. I mean, yeah, a big old building out on the moors, like, perfect. So we don't know if Emily Bronte and Anne Lister actually crossed paths, but we do know that she stayed at her house and they would have been in similar circles. So, yeah, the next site, we're going to go down and up to the Minster. Oh no, we're going up Stonegate. We're going to stop at Oliver Bonus en route. So this is 35 Stonegate, and this is one of the most incredible buildings inside. Unfortunately, Oliver Bonus moved in and covered up all the Jacobean panelling, and there's like...
But it's still there.
So there's, yeah, some of it's still there, but a lot of it's covered up. I guess it's been covered up just to maintain it. There's also a lot of stained glass, because as you can see at the sign above, John Knowles was sort of the local stained glass expert, and so a lot of his work is in, obviously, in the windows here and some of the windows up the top as well. If you ever went inside it when it was the haunted house and they had it as was, with the very old carpets and all the wood panelling and the lamps on the walls, it was absolutely stunning. So it is such a shame. That is my dream building. If ever I had the money to open a bookshop, that's where it would be. Yeah. Bookshop, cafe, printing press, as was.
Will be only $1 million.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think it sold for 1.3 at the last. Yeah, because it's a massive building. Because it goes up 4 floors, it goes right back, and then this passageway goes down, and there's workshops out the back.
But
so it's a huge
liability as well.
Well, yeah, that. And maintaining it's probably going to cost.
Right. So.
Yeah, it will be. So, it was opened as a bookshop in 1682. It had its own printing press out the back, as did a lot of the shops down here. A lot of the shops are associated with printing and bookbinding and... And so the Bible that hangs above the door that says Holy Bible 1682 is actually to signify that the bookshop was called At the Sign of the Bible. That's where it can be found, at the Sign of the Bible. So the thing that's important with this in terms of queer history is this is the where the first editions of Lawrence Sterne's Tristram Shandy were sold. There is actually a blue plaque. It's been missing for several years because the glass got knocked out, and obviously being listed and being set into stained glass, which it's the only plaque that is in York, it took forever for them to replace it. So it was here at 35 Stonegate that one of the strangest, most experimental books of its time, highly sexually suggestive for the 18th century, was sold and published. We're actually going to go to Lawrence Sterne's house. It's just behind the Minster. But his writing was full of sort of intense sexuality in an age where it was kind of very repressed. In his book A Sentimental Journey, he explores male sexual desire and all the constraints that go along with it, demonstrating how the cult of sensibility both encouraged and repressed these expressions of longing, male-to-male love. His narrator flirts with these transgressions all the way through the book. And then there's Tristram Shandy, which is the book that was first sold here. It's a novel, it's a very strange novel, very experimental, and sex is kind of woven through the threads of it very deeply, but not mentioned. It's very sort of sexually charged, but without any sort of opportunity for release, I guess. It's a very frustrating book to read, but I recommend it. You know, if you've got several weeks to kill, that's definitely the book I would recommend. It's actually said that through his writing, he kind of stumbled upon the roots of perversion long before Freud ever theorised about it. And that was through writing things like Tristram Shandy. So he's very ahead of his time. Now, I don't have anything to suggest that he was queer himself, but it was certainly in his writing. He certainly wrote a lot about it. Having looked at some of his letters and diaries, I can't find anything yet that puts him in the archive as a person, but his writing is definitely in there. So, yeah, that's Lawrence Sterne. The next site, we're going to go to the Minster, and I'll talk a little bit about the Brontes again, and then we'll move on to Charles Dickens. Okay, so this is kind of the last leg of the tour, I guess. So I just wanted to add something about the Brontes, just because I think standing on Coney Street, you don't really feel, you know, the Brontes there, but when you look up at this and you consider their literature, I call it gothic grandeur and intensity, that definitely comes through in their novels. You can see why they were attracted to it. And also coming from the tiny parsonage and then standing in this, must have been a bit of a culture shock. A few years ago, me and my friend went to London, and I put together a bit of a literature tour, and I was determined to find the Brontes in London, and they weren't ones for leaving the house very often. They didn't like to go further afield. So the only story I could find of the Brontes in London was Charlotte Bronte took the manuscripts that we, waiting to be delivered, got on the train, got off at King's Cross. The publisher's was 2 streets away. She got back on the same train and came home. So there's nothing in London connected to the Brontes at all, because she literally did not want to be there. So Charlotte was the kind of adult, she looked after, when all the others had died, she was the one who kind of preserved and sanitized the legacies of her sisters. So there was actually a book that Emily was working on that supposedly was more scandalous than Wuthering Heights, but we'll never know because Charlotte put it in the fire. Nothing remains of it. There's no letters that reference it. We know that something was written. That's it. So Charlotte's a bit of a strange one in terms of sexuality. She was kind of, in the way that we talked about Anne Lister as kind of masculine and maybe gender non-conforming, maybe lesbian, maybe trans, we don't know. There's, you don't know how far to sort of go on it. But she was known to have very intense, let's say friendships, but her letters are very intense compared to her sisters anyway, and for the time. And as we mentioned earlier, Vita Sackville-West, Virginia Woolf's lover, she edited Charlotte Bronte's letters and said, these are love letters, pure and simple. That's it. So I think I would take her word for it as probably the expert on that.
And did she like to use her masculine name, Charlotte?
She did. She was the one that, so hers was Cora Bell, and she went by that.
In letters?
Yeah, signing in letters, in person. She liked to to sort of maintain the male. I don't know if it maybe gave her, I don't know, a grander sense of self, or if it was kind of to assert a dominance or what, but from what we gather, she was quite a domineering woman of her time. So
persona maybe to a point as well.
Possibly, yeah.
Interesting that it's on the love letters though too. That's,
yeah. So the next stop, we're going to go into the Museum Gardens. It's not called Museum Gardens, it's Dean's Park. I found that out yesterday.
Museum Gardens.
Yeah, Museum Gardens, yeah, around there. That's the next stop. So, like Lawrence Stern, who sort of earns his place in the archive because of his writing rather than his, sexuality. This site is connected with Charles Dickens, particularly because of these windows here. So these are known as the Five Sisters windows. The story goes, supposedly, that 5 local sisters were sitting in their gardens embroidering, and the religious figure, father, it says father in the text, but I suppose it would have been the dean, telling them not to waste their time with such fun and frivolity. But actually, the story goes in Charles Dickens' novel Nicholas Nickleby that they return home and basically go about their miserable lives, no longer embroidering. One of the sisters dies, and they turn the 5 patterns of their embroidery into 5 stained glass windows. Now, whether this story is true or not, we don't know. It's recorded in Nicholas Nickleby at length during a cab ride from the north to the south. It's also worth remembering that at the time, Dickens was paid by the word, so he put any old fluff in. He wrote a lot of unnecessary, there's a lot of
thickness.
Yeah, some of the books come in several parts. He's obviously got a huge back catalogue, and it's because he's paid by the word, so he was incentivized to write longer and longer books, and so he did. So Charles Dickens used to visit York quite a lot. He had a brother and a close personal friend who lived in Malton, but he liked to stop in York on his way to Malton, and he walked through these gardens and got the story for the 5 windows from walking through here. So there are a lot of queer themes that run through his novels, and they've sort of long been debated. I've got a few here. So in Dombey and Son in 1846, he introduces a character called Major Bagstock, a flamboyant, unmarried older man who insists he was once known as the Flower. Just 3 years earlier, the MP William Banks had been arrested with a soldier who was called Flower, with their trousers down, apparently. Banks fled the country in disgrace. So this is something that was going on around the time of Dickens writing that novel, and so he slotted it in. So that's not too crude to say. In David Copperfield, in 1850, David's schoolboy crush on James Steerforth is painted with, admiration, obsession, and it's kind of intense. In 1835, James Pratt and John Smith became the last men executed in the UK for same-sex relations. While imprisoned at Newgate, they were seen by Charles Dickens. He went to visit them, and he wrote of their horror and despair and sat and talked to them. While a lot of other writers at the time condemned them as degraded and sinful, Charles Dickens didn't judge. He just sat and talked to them. So sort of like a rare moment of compassion, I suppose. So these sort of themes do come up in a lot of his writing, and there are a lot of sort of queer coded characters in a time where you couldn't really write about it, and we would read them now as queer, but whether or not Charles Dickens actually was queer himself, or just was a compassionate person and wanted to include all facets of life, because he did. In his novels he wrote about everyone from top to bottom.
If only he was as compassionate to his wife.
Well, yeah, one of the things that he's not earned his place in the archive yet, but some of the letters between him and his friend who he visited in Malton are interesting. But it's kind of some people that want to argue that they're sort of homosexual in nature will find that, and some people who want to argue against it will also find that. So it's kind of, there's not enough really there to confirm, but yeah, if I can confirm, I will put him in the archive. So there's still time yet.
Are you okay with that?
So the next site, we're going to go over here to just next to the Treasurer's house, where the back of Gray's Court is. So this house here, so this is the back of Gray's Court. Obviously if you go down the passageway and into the big courtyard, the front of the building is far more impressive. But this building has kind of a lot of history. And it's been around since, I think, the 12th or 11th century, and it has been consistently occupied since then. It's the longest consistently occupied building in Europe, supposedly. So, as the plaque here, so Jack Stern was the father of Lawrence Stern, and he lived here in this house. One of the sort of conference rooms, what would have been, I guess, a ballroom, it's enormous, is now called the Stern Room, after Jack Stern. The other sort of character of interest is James I, we'll come back to. So if you go into Gray's Court and go upstairs, they've got a long Jacobean gallery. It's stunning, with the wood panelling and everything. And
only £5 there, so
it's wonderful in there. So there is a plaque on the wall. James I visited here, and he invited 10 local dignitaries, and basically they had a big feast and a big ball and an uproarious time, and at the end of the night, I'm guessing a little bit worse for wear, James I knighted all 10 blokes. So they walked in as 10 local dignitaries and left as little peers of the realm. So yeah,
not a bad one.
That's not a bad night out, is it?
That's all right. Memorable.
I'm assuming that they were invited here for the for the dinner, for the evening, for the ambiance.
What did they have to do for the knighthood?
Well, I mean, who sent out the invites? I mean, given what he did with his other favourites. So, so I think we sort of assume that, although the dinner was here, he probably stayed at King's Manor, although Gray's Court do maintain that he stayed here. Unfortunately, that means 11 men for only 10 bedrooms. So, surprising. Yeah, so I guess we have to make our own conclusions there. But I'm assuming he was probably escorted back to King's Manor and stayed the night there. So the next site is just down there where the blue plaque is on the left. This is kind of a recent addition to my archive. I'm still kind of exploring it more fully. So she lived here in her youth, and then moved to Bath and then London. She was the founding member of the Blue Stockings movement, and to commemorate, blue socks. So Elizabeth Montagu was one of the founding members. Two of the others were Hester Thrale and Elizabeth Carter. So I've done it again. Hang on. Magnet. There we go. So the Blue Stocking movement was basically a group of mostly women that would have been excluded from high society because they weren't as educated and they didn't have the same sort of entitlement to intellectual circles. So it was sort of a founding movement to reject the idea that education and intellectual pursuits weren't just for men. So she hosted salons, edited her own works, edited the works of a number of the members, and she had a lot of influence. So Elizabeth Montagu is a bit of a strange one because obviously high society, a lot of things not recorded in certain ways, but I do have a letter of hers stating that she hated all men, wanted nothing to do with them. I don't know if that's enough to solidify a place in the archive, because she did marry a man, but he was 30 years her senior, and at the time, I think estimated maybe the 5th richest man in the UK, because he owned a lot of the mills and pits and industrial kind of guy.
She did the original Anne Nicole Smith.
So yeah, basically I think that's the thing, is she hated men, but she's not daft. So, but he was 30 years older than her, and he died, and she inherited his money and managed to open all these salons and sort of start this intellectual movement. So there are a number of women that are members of the Blue Stocking movement that are definitely going in the archive. They're not associated with York, unfortunately, because by this time she was down in Bath in London. But her cousin, Lady Mary Montague, was, well, she's been described as a bisexual spy. She was kind of, yeah, she did what she needed to do to get through the right circles. And Sarah Fielding, a novelist, she wrote about homosocial desire, and Hester Thrale, one of the founding members, wrote very intense romantic letters to other women. And Elizabeth Carter, one of the other founding members, was known as the English Sappho. Obviously at the time, Sappho was meant as a kind of a slur. So yeah, but it's kind of indicative of the type of writing and the context of what she was writing about, that she sort of earned that moniker. There were a number of women, particularly in this society, that were given the Sappho name, so it was quite a common thread. So yes, she hasn't quite earned a place in my archive yet, but we're working on it. And yes, for now, the Blue Stocking movement is in the archive, but Elizabeth Montague is, yeah, not firmly established yet. So the next stop, we're going to go to St William's College, just down here, where we're going to talk about Edward Carpenter. Okay.
Because she had a long life.
This is our penultimate stop. So this is probably the newest addition to my archive. It's something I only came across very recently, purely by accident. I was looking at the poet George Merrill, who was in an openly gay relationship in Sheffield. And obviously when I hear any sort of Yorkshire town, I think, right, where are they? Where are they in York? Have they been? Have they come? You know, have they visited? So unfortunately couldn't find George Merrill in York, but I did find his partner, Edward Carpenter. So Edward Carpenter is actually a really fascinating figure, and one I'm definitely going to have to explore more for this archive, because there's so much more to find out. So he was a poet, philosopher, socialist, gay rights pioneer, environmentalist, an advocate for free love, and an all-round Victorian rebel, basically. He spent his life questioning the structures of class, gender, and sexuality. This was at a time when Oscar Wilde's trial was basically happening in the UK. He was living openly with his male partner, who's also a poet, George Merrill, in a committed relationship. He wrote extensively on what he called the intermediate sex, which is basically an early radical theory of gender and sexual fluidity, kind of before we had proper like trans theory. It was this idea of the fluidity and how there is no binary, there is no fixed identity. And he wrote at length about that ahead of you know, psychologists who finally gave sort of medical terminology to these things. So Edward Carpenter stayed here. He was a teacher, and in his early life he was a Quaker, so he would go around basically giving religious talks and lectures. I believe when he came here he was giving a talk on astronomy. He was a very well educated man. He knew a lot about a lot of different things. So I believe it was here that he was giving a talk on astronomy. It may have been something else. However, when his lecture tour finished a year or so later, he decided that the next thing he needed to do to basically do a deep dive on writing the intermediate sex was to travel to America and spend some time with Walt Whitman, who's basically the granddaddy of queer American poetry. That's the guy you want to go and see if you want to know more. Walt Whitman is also the guy who, he was friends with Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde went and stayed with him. And Bram Stoker, who wrote Dracula, wrote some very intense letters to Walt Whitman. So yes, so Walt Whitman's kind of a key character when you look at queer history, because everybody wanted to, you know, get to know him and do a bit more of what he was doing. So Edward Carpenter's influence actually extends a bit further into kind of the next generation, because he was living in Sheffield very openly with his partner. Actually, in the 1920s census, his partner George Merrill was listed as the live-in housekeeper, which is one of those things that a lot of historians go, well, they were roommates or whatever. But it's no, their letters and their diaries, and they live very openly. And it's believed that their relationship is the inspiration for E.M. Forster's Maurice, written in 1913, but it was too scandalous to be published until 1971. So yeah, in a world where queer love stories were mostly tragedies, E.M. Forster's novel dared to imagine a different ending, one where two men could live and love freely outside of society's constraints. And they lived together for 40 years. Obviously, you know, historians will try and erase them by saying they just lived together for 40 years. They were very close friends. But yeah, the letters and the poetry and all the writing says otherwise. He would have stayed, I believe, in a building just down where this sort of doorway is, this sort of archway. There's a building down there I believe he stayed in, but supposedly he gave his lecture in here. So yeah, so that's sort of a fantastic connection to have with York. And obviously St William's College sort of leads us on to the next thing I'm going to talk about. Hang on, I'm going to tear that. Not even folded anymore. Oh yeah, the last thing on Edward Carpenter. I heard him described in an academic article as the Victorian Morrissey, because he was he was an advocate for simple living, he was a vegetarian, well ahead of his time, and he was sort of an activist when that wasn't necessarily a popular thing to do. So yeah, the next site we're going to go to is we're going to go back towards the front of the Minster near the Roman column and talk about the last person on the tour, which is the Alcuin of York. Okay. Now let me fold this so that it doesn't completely dissolve. This is probably the furthest we go back in this tour anyway. Obviously in the wider archive we go back as far as the Romans, but in this we go back to the 8th century and talk about the Alcuin of York. So he was a scholar and probably one of the most powerful scholars of his age, and so he was a teacher at York. He would have been in this building here and was later travelling around Europe as an advisor to Charlemagne.
Timothy.
No. Yes, he's lived since the 8th century just to meet Timothy Chalamet. And if you read some of his letters, I wouldn't be surprised. So he wrote a lot about theology and philosophy, but his letters read like love poetry. And they are kind of intense for the time. If you've read Catullus, like the Roman poet, his stuff's kind of intense and banned. A lot of it was banned. The Alcuin of York writes a lot of stuff like that. So there are a lot of things that are kind of brotherly love, as they probably would be categorised, and just sort of like a bromance kind of thing. But then some of the stuff's a bit more intense. He was a big fan of an armpit, an elbow, the back of the knee. He really goes in on detail in his poetry to sort of describe how much he wants to lick and bite and touch and all these things, very obscure male body parts. So obviously when we look at what was going on at the time, and in terms of in religious circles, the early medieval church had rituals of brother making, which a lot of scholars now argue would have resembled same-sex unions. We do know from St William's College, where the monks lived, that before the houses were built here, and down just past the end of this building, there would have been an archway, and from St William's College through the archway into the city of York, you could see right into what was the red light district, now known as Great Plain. And so it was bricked up and houses built in front of it so as not to tempt the monks, because they used to climb out at night and go down Great Plain. So we know that, you know, I used to work in one of the buildings near here, and all the courtyards for all the buildings are sealed off because it's just buildings all the way around. And the owner asked why we couldn't take our bins out properly, and I said because of kinky monks. And apparently that didn't go down so well, but that's literally the reason. They filled that in. So yeah, so we're going back like 1300 years to the Alcuin of York. He wasn't here for a great deal of time. He grew up here. By the time he was writing these letters, he was on the continent. But we can still read his poetry today. So it's kind of a fascinating record for that far back. So that's the end of my damp tour. So this is part of a wider project that is called Nowt So Queer. You can find my website, nowtsoqueer.co.uk. And it's my PhD project, so I'm working on queering the archive. So the first stage of that was building the archive, so researching it and finding out all the information. Obviously, because it's an academic pursuit, I have to get all the references, so I really have to. I mean, the method a lot of the time is argue for, then argue against, and see what comes out at the end. Because obviously, you look at who writes the history, and sometimes people want it sanitised for certain reasons. But you only have to look at people like Julius Caesar to realise what we were taught in school versus the reality of the situation. Very different. So, so I'm working on that project. My PhD finishes in 2 years, so I'm in the write-up stage at the moment. My hope is that, funding permitted, there will be an app for you all to beta test next LGBT History Month. It's going to contain text and audio, images, creative prompts. So it might be writing, or it might be making space. So creating sort of queer space in this sort of project for like queer futurity, so like queer futures, and just taking up a bit of space because we've been erased so much. And the hope is to get some extra texts and voices and creative responses to the history, so the archive can grow and grow and grow. So that's the plan. So hopefully by next year we'll be able to go out and do some of the sites on our own. Go out and there's 58 at the moment. Hopefully by next year there'll be a few more. But I've still got hundreds of documents to get through. Thank you for coming. Thank you very much. And thank you for braving the elements. It's been kind of intense.
Oh, you've done well.
I'll be sending Jake an email. You got off lightly yesterday.
Of course, yeah.
Hopefully we could do something for Pride Month.
Yeah.
Because I think this would go down a storm. You know, get Jake and some of the others as well to maybe do like one every weekend or something, apart from Pride weekend, obviously.
Especially in the summer.
I think to do it during the summer and get out and do something. So.
Learn some history, get your 10,000 steps in.
That's it. I don't know how many we've walked today.
Yeah, I don't know, but yeah.
Cool.
Thank you.
Hiya. Yeah. So I'll have to go home and reassemble this. Yeah.
Oh my god, yeah, honestly.
Do you want to grab a coffee?
Yeah, let's
Shall we go
grab
and
a
go
coffee
coffee?
then.